While shock extensions have allowed us to run our factory shocks with the 2.5 inches of lift that we have on our JL Wrangler, I can't say that they've been the best solution, or at least not for us anyway. Running bigger tires and heavier wheels, there are definitely times when we felt that they just can't keep up with the additional weight. Needless to say, we've been looking for a better solution for quite some time now, and as luck would have it, our good friends over at Rancho were able to help us out, and with something entirely new. Made specifically with the JL Wrangler in mind, Rancho took their recently redesigned and ever popular RS5000X and improved upon it by adding an all-new feature called DRS, or Dynamic Rebound Spring Technology. Essentially, it's a unique internal component that utilizes a tuned metal spring that, among other things, provides greater control, reduces body roll, and prevents rod overextension. As an added bonus, these shocks can be had in both a stock length or an extended length that offers 2.5 inches of greater travel up front, 4.5 inches in the rear, and for our purposes, that means we can get rid of our shock extensions and get a bit more droop in the rear. While it isn't necessary to raise your Jeep or remove its tires to swap out a set of shocks, it can be helpful to put its frame rails up on a set of jack stands, or in our case, rack it up just so that you can let the axles droop out. By doing this, you'll have more access to nuts and bolts on the shocks themselves, and it'll help you to work with pressurized shocks. So we just went ahead and racked our Jeep up, and we're going to get these shocks swapped out now. For our purposes, we're going to go ahead and remove our wheels just so that you can get a better idea of what we're doing. Okay, so now that we got our wheel off, we're going to go ahead and take a floor jack. We're going to use it to raise the axle just a bit, just to relieve some of the pressure off of the shock. Just a little bit of pressure off. Because we've got shock extensions, we're going to have to go ahead and remove the bolt securing the shock to it before we can actually remove the bracket itself. So we're going to use a 19mm ratchet and a wrench. Let's do that now. That removed, we can now take an 18mm wrench and an 18mm socket. And remove the lower bolt. Okay, so now we can carefully lower the jack just enough to get the shock out of the bracket. All right, there's a crush sleeve down here we're going to have to remove. That out of the way, you can go ahead and use 9/16 inch socket and wrench to remove the rest of this hardware. Okay. Now finally, there's a bolt up here securing the shock to the upper shock mount, and we're going to have to remove that using an 18mm socket. Okay. As you can see, the new Rancho shock is physically longer than the factory shock, and of course it has the DRS inside of it, so it's actually limiting the amount of extension that we see here. The full weight of the axle itself will pull this down even further. As you can see here also, on these boxes, the numbers ending in 65 represent the front shocks, and the ones that end in 66, these are for the rear. Just like on the factory shock, the Rancho shocks come with a crush sleeve up on top that go on the upper shock mount and a smaller one on the lower shock mount. So this is how you know which direction it needs to be installed. Okay, taking the factory hardware, we're going to now secure our new Rancho shock to the upper shock mount. And in order to do that, we're going to take this, slide it up, and then the whole fender liner needs to be kind of pulled back in order to get to it. There. With the shock attached to the upper mount, we can now go ahead and raise our axle again just a bit so that we can get it lined up into the lower mount on the axle. Okay, looks like I went a little bit high on the jack, so I'm going to use a pry bar just to help inch up the base of the shock so I can get this bolt in. We're going to take our bracket for our brake lines, slip that through, go ahead and reinstall the nut. And now secure everything back in place using an 18mm socket and wrench. Okay, there we go. Got our front shock installed. Now to get to the rear. Once again, this is totally unnecessary, but being that we are filming this, I'm going to go ahead and remove our rear wheel so that you can get a better idea of what we're doing. So again, using our floor jack, we're just going to take a little bit of the weight off of our rear axle so that it's easier to remove the shocks. As before, we're going to use an 18mm wrench and 18mm socket to remove the lower bolt. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and remove the rear upper shock bolt using an 18mm socket again. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at how these compare. So you can see front to rear, the rear shock is actually longer. So that explains why Rancho includes longer shocks. So we're not actually going to get any more droop out of them, but they're actually going to be longer than the factory ones. So we're pretty good there. Before we install our new Rancho shock, we're going to go ahead and remove our relocation bracket so that we can install it on the factory mount. Go ahead and use an 18mm wrench and socket. Gonna have to remove the sway bar links first. Okay, using a 9/16 inch socket and wrench, we're going to go ahead and remove bolts attaching the strap brackets to the lower control arm mounts. Okay, got rid of that bracket. Now we can go ahead and install our shocks. There are two different bolts. If you lost track, the shorter bolt goes to the lower mount. The longer bolt goes to the upper mount. So we're going to go ahead and take our new Rancho shock, slip it up, pop in this bolt, go ahead and secure it in place. Alright, as you get to the end, you don't actually want to tighten up this bolt super tight because it is a bonded rubber bushing onto this crush sleeve, or at least it feels like it. So I'm going to leave it just loose enough so I can swing it into place onto the axle. Okay, as before, I went a little high on the jack, but rather than lowering it, I'm just going to use a pry bar just to help shock up just a bit. Take the bolt, pop it in, go ahead, get this thing secured in place. Okay, so now we can go back up and tighten up this the upper bolt as well. With the shock installed, we can go ahead and reinstall our sway bar link. Okay, and that's it. Rear shock is installed. All you need to do is repeat the process on the opposite side, and you're good to go. Here are a few shots of what our brand new Rancho RS5000X shocks look like installed on our Jeep JL Wrangler. Remember, both front and rear upper shock bolts will need to be tightened to 81 foot-pounds of torque, and the lower bolts to 74 foot-pounds. Now that we got these brand new Rancho RS5000X shocks installed, it's time to do some testing. Alright, so now we're getting into some rockier terrain. The trail is a little bit more of like a cobblestone situation where, I don't know, everything is about the size of a softball or a little bit bigger. And what we noticed with the factory shocks was that either they were packing up or they were having a hard time keeping up with the new weight of tires and wheels that we have installed. But the ride was always a little bit rougher and harsher. There was just something about it I wasn't quite happy with. But here, as you can see, maybe, or even here, these new Ranchos are handling it a lot better. So I'm pretty happy with it. Alright, so now we're up into some bigger rocks here, and so far so good. It'd be nice if we could get a little bit more articulation out of these, but compared to the stock shocks with the relocation brackets or the extension brackets, I still feel like these Ranchos are doing much better. Pretty happy with them. While they're far from being a set of coilovers, from the testing that I've done, I've found that the all-new Rancho RS5000X shocks are a huge improvement over stock. And at about $55 a pop, the price is hard to beat. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the JL Journal, and if you're not already a member, we would love for you to come by jlwrangler.com and become a part of our online community. Until next time, keep the shiny side up, all four on the floor, and with any luck, we'll see you on the trail.